Hello over there, guys who are streaming online. Welcome back to this another session on a Spring Boot playlist. This is the seventh lesson on this playlist, and this particular video is about to teach you basically on how to configure database connection in your Spring Boot application and how to configure the properties so that your application can be able to connect to your suitable database. So for our case, we will be using both the properties file to configure the properties, and we will also be using the YAML file to demonstrate how we can configure the database configuration to our application so that our application can be able to connect. If you have not watched the previous lessons from lesson 1 to lesson 6, I would argue that you go and watch so that you can be able to reconnect with this lesson 7 before we can be able to introduce more concepts on Spring Boot playlist. I hope really this session is going to be very enjoyable, and if you have questions to ask, remember this is a live chat. You can type your questions in the live chat and I will be able to respond to it. Also, after this session, we will be having an online Zoom meeting so that we can be able to ask the questions which we want to ask about this particular lesson. Otherwise, let us, without wasting time, let us go straight to the content of the video and explain how we can be able to add the configurations in our application so that we can be able to connect to our application. For our case, we will be using MySQL database, but these configurations are just the same with any other database of your choice. You only need to change the database the database specific configurations. So without wasting time, let me turn to our slide and we can be able to follow along. So if you have not attended the previous lessons, in lesson 1 we covered the lesson on introduction to Spring Boot, and lesson 2 we looked at this architecture of Spring Boot framework, the 4 layers of Spring Boot, and we explained all these layers. And then in lesson 3, we looked at the sample project which we will be using and which we will be developing as we continue with this session. And we explained that we are going to build a simple learning management portal which will be able to manage these entities. We will have the users, the student, the instructor, and the course entities. And then in lesson 4, we looked at how we can set up our environment by installing all these tools. I believe that if you are following this playlist, you already have these tools installed on your computer, or if you are maybe looking in this particular video, then I guess you already have some familiar basic knowledge about Spring Boot, and you should be having these tools installed on your machine so that you can be able to practice the practical part of this course. It is really very necessary. And then in lesson 5, we created our first Spring Boot application, and we created a simple controller which was able to return a simple text hello world on sending the request. So in this particular lesson, we want to take a look at how we can initialize and create database configuration to our application so that we can be able to add and manipulate the entities in our database. So without having waste of time, let us turn to our IDE, and I'm going to open the previous project which we had created. So the previous project which we had created was this one, Code Archive Learning Management System. So I'm going to open it in a new window. and here the project opens. So this, you can see that this is the project which we created in our previous class. And in our previous class, we simply created a simple controller, REST controller, with this endpoint. And this is the endpoint function which was able to return this symbol text on the screen. So I'm going again to run this project so that we can just be able to see our project. And then from there, we are going to demonstrate how we can now add the database configurations. So you can see that our project is now running, and when we go to our browser and we go to http localhost port 8080 /API, then /v1/greetings, then we are going to get the response from our application. So let us, the page is not visible, the application is still running, so let us turn to our application and see if it has already completed. So it is still running. So that is the endpoint we are simply hitting, and when we hit this endpoint, our controller, we are able to get the feedback. Alright, so as the application runs, we are going to add the configuration properties. And in the previous lesson, we said that we have this file under this resource folder, which is called application.properties. So this is the file that we are going to use to add the properties to any application properties to our application. For example, we may add the port number for application, we may add the database configuration, we may add the security configuration, and all the other properties which are required by our application. So we are going to use this port number to add the configurations to our application. And then before we can use that port number, we need to ensure that we have the right dependencies in our application. So to do that, we are going to need two dependencies to be able to continue. First of all, we need to add the database specific dependency. For our case, we are going to use the MySQL database. So we will need to add the MySQL database driver dependency in our pom.xml file. And then we will also need to add the JPA dependency, which will enable us to manipulate and to access the data. So for our case, without wasting time, I don't want to waste time, I'm going to this previous project that I had created, and I'm going to just directly copy these dependencies, and then I'm going to add them into our application. So the first dependency we need is this, the spring.starter data GPA. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it in this file of ours. So we come to the pom.xml file and we paste this dependency. And then another dependency that we need, we also need the MySQL dependency, MySQL driver dependency, this one here, which will be able to add the MySQL driver in our application. So here we are going to also add this dependency in our application. And then after that, we are going to have to reload the Maven file so that this dependency can be added, can be resolved and added to our application. So you can also get these dependencies online on Maven repository. I will put the link in the video section, and you can also, when you are creating a new project, if you need to add this dependency, then you can always go to the MySQL section, and then you add the MySQL driver dependency, and you also add the Spring Data GPA dependency. So for our case, because we have already created the project, so we will not need to add them manually. So these are the dependencies, two dependencies that you need. If you want to use another database apart from MySQL, then you need to make sure that you have added the correct dependency here. Instead of MySQL, let us say you want to use Oracle database, or you want to use Postgre database, then you need to add this respective dependencies for these respective database here. But for our case, we are going to use MySQL, and therefore we need to add the MySQL driver dependency here. And then the starter data GPA is the library which will help us to provide us some of the functions out of the box, and we will be able to use this Java persistence library to be able to persist our data from our application in our database. So this is a very handy and useful tool that we will be using. Alright, so we go back to our application. I think our application is already running an app. Let me click on this, and you can see that our application is already started and it is running on port 8080. So in this particular lesson, we will also look on how we can change the port number. For now, our application is running on port 8080. When you go back to our browser and reload this page, you can see that here we will have the previous result of the previous application that we've built. You can see this here we're supposed to be typing port 8080. Here we've typed port 8000. So here 8080, and when you click on that, you'll be able to see this is the result of the controller that we built. So in this lesson, let us go straight after we have added the dependency and the pom.xml has been reloaded. The next thing you need to do is to go to this application.properties, and then you are going to add the Spring, the data source configuration properties. So the first thing is you need to add is Spring dot data source, and then you can see that you are given, we have these options to configure the data source or the data. You are going to tell your application from which source of the database should your application be able to read or add the data. So we are going to add the Spring data source URL, and then we also need to add the Spring. So for our URL here, I'm going to copy the previous URL which I have in my application. So this is my Spring data URL. So I'm going to have to copy this URL and use the same URL in the current application, but you can use a different one. So here what I'm simply saying is that you are telling the application that connect to this database which is on localhost port 3306, and then the database name is in ChatDB. And then here I'm going to use a different database because we are building e-learning. I have a database already which I have created in my SQL. This is the database called e-learning management system. For now, I don't have any tables, but this is basically the database. So this is the database that we will be using to add all the entities. So we are going to connect to this database. So for us to tell the Spring application, then we are going to specify the name of the database in that particular data. So we are going to create, it is going to connect to e-learning database, and then here we are telling Spring that connect to this database, and if you find that this database does not exist, then create a new database with this name. So we set this value to true, and then we also need to set the Spring data source, and then we need to tell the username. What is the username of your database? For mine it is root. And then you also need to configure the spring.data password, the password for your database. For mine here it is Sam at 1996, something of that. This is the password for my local database. For yours it might be different. And then you also need to add another configuration which are not part of this. So these are the three main ones, and then also you need to add the GPA configuration if you need, but these are optional. So for our case here, let us add the say spring.gpa properties, and then we're going to say that show SQL statement, and we're going to set it to true. And then also we need to also specify the properties, the dialect, the MySQL database dialect that we are using. So we are going to specify spring.gpa, and then we are going to use the Hibernate, this particular property, and then we are going to say update, and then we are also going to specify spring.gpa Hibernate spring.data.gpa, then dot properties, and then we are going to set the Hibernate MySQL dialect. So I'm going to use this one, the one I've been using in my previous. So I'm just going to copy this, and we are going to put it in that particular position. All right. So guys, let us explain these properties that we have added. So we are saying that the first property here is to specify the URL where your database is located. For mine, it is located on localhost on this port, and this is the database name. And then you need to specify the username for your database so that your application can be able to reach to this database and then log in using this username and password. And then here we are specifying the SQL true, so that when we run our application and our application creates any table or adds any data into our database, we should be able to see the SQL statement in the logs so that we can be able to know which SQL statement has been carried out by our application. And then this particular property, DDL auto, DDL stands for data definition language auto update, which means that we are telling our application that when you connect to this database, then you need to update the data. For example, if initially we already have one table and we have added another table, then you just go and update and add another table. Or if we have one table with 6 columns and then in our code again we add another column, then our application should just go and update the current database and add that one extra column, and that is what we mean by update. Apart from update, we have other properties. We can maybe use create or create drop. Create, which means that we are going to create a new database. So whenever there is a change, anytime the application restarts and connects to our database, then it is going to drop that application, it is going to drop that database which already exists with all the data, and it is going to create another one. So this is the meaning of this data DDL auto. And then here in the last line we are simply specifying the database dialect. So here we are using MySQL dialect. This one is optional, you can specify or you can leave it, but these are the key properties which you need to configure. You need to configure the URL, you need to configure the username, and you also need to configure the password. So otherwise, these are all the steps. The first step is you need to add the dependencies, which we have added in our POM, these 2 dependencies. And then the second step is you need to go to your properties and then add these particular properties in your properties file. Apart from using the properties file, you can also use another file called the application.yml file, which you will be able to add the same configuration, but we will look at that particular one in the next video, where we also add the same configurations using the .yml file. So also here we need, let us configure the port. For now our application is running on port 8080. So let us change this port and we maybe make our application to run on port 8085, for example. So how can we do that? We still come into this application properties and we are going to configure the port number. So we are going to add this property spring.server, not spring, but we are going to use server.port. And here we are going to specify the port of our choice, 8085. So let us run this application to see the changes which have occurred. And here we are not going to see any change. What is going to happen is that after the application runs, then this application is just going to know that it is going to look into POM XML and find that there is these 2 dependencies. And if it finds these two dependencies, it means that it needs to connect to the MySQL database. Then it will go to the properties file and check whether the configurations have been added in the properties file. So it will find this configuration, and then it will pick up, and then it is going to connect to this localhost 306, and then it will connect to this particular database. If the database does not exist, it will create another one, and then it is going to log into that database using the root username and then the password. All right, and you can see that this is my SQL. Here I have my SQL database up and running locally, and this is the database that my application is going to connect to. So if I create any tables in my code, then these tables are going to be added to this database. So let us go to our code, and you can see that our application is up and running. And here, when you look at this particular line here, you can see that the Tomcat now is running on port 8085 instead of 8080, because we have changed the port number by adding this symbol property here. All right. So when we go back to our browser and reload the same, then we are going to get an error, because now the port, their port is different. So when we put the right port here, 8085, then we are going to get the same response back here. Otherwise, guys, I hope you find this content useful. This is 30 minutes this session, but I think we have taken less than that, and that is a very nice thing. And if you have any question, please share it in the comment section, and also make sure that you reach out so that we can be able to answer your questions. So in the next lesson, we will be able to create our first entity, and we will be able to implement this layer called the data access layer, where we create the entities, and then we will be able to create the respective GPA repositories, and we will be able to add the data into the database, into this database that we have configured, so that we can be able to create the tables and add the database within our code here. Otherwise, I hope the session is enjoyable, and see you in the next lesson, which is lesson 6.